Philip, can you make Chloe Stuber, parentheses, real Chloe, the host?
For everyone already signed in, we're going to get started here in just a minute. Charlie, our chair, is still on his way.
So I think there was a small hiccup and now Jimmy Bailey is the host.
Game of hot potato, pass around the host role.
Right. Do you want to tell me how to give it? I don't see that I have it, but I'll give it to someone else if I do.
Yeah, Jimmy, if you go to my name, it says Chloe Stuber, real Chloe, and hover your cursor over it and then go click on more. It should give you the option to make me host.
I don't think I'm the host. Oh, hold on.
Yeah, you are. You're listed as the host, Jimmy.
Okay.
You're managing the meeting now.
Wow. It's a lot of power. Let's see.
Yes, you do.
Do you want to? Okay, I think I just did it.
Yes,
Yep,
successful.
it
Thank
worked.
you very much. Go team. And here's Charlie.
Hey, I'm sorry I was running late.
That's okay. We're ready for you. Christopher, I don't know if he told you, Christopher's going to be hopefully joining us at some point, but we don't need to wait for him to get going.
Okay. I'm assuming I'm going to open up the meeting and then we're going to, I'm going to turn it over to staff for everything else, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. We'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the special Planning Commission meeting of February 22nd, 2021. We're here to get updates on the city plan. So I'm going to ask Chloe, who from staff is going to lead in this meeting or take over?
I'll take it from here.
Thank you, Chloe.
Okay, Jim, next slide, please. Thanks, everybody. We're going to try and keep this short. We just wanted to share some additional findings from our housing analysis. At our last meeting, we were awaiting some of our final deliverables from the community data platform. So now we have those. We're going to give you some additional updates from that. Then I am going to go over very quickly our timeline for spring engagement. And something that wasn't on the agenda I sent out previously, we've added in, we have special guests with us during this meeting, some graduate students from the College of Charleston, Masters of Public Administration program, graduate assistants with the Community Assistance Program there are working with us on incorporating racial equity into the city plan. So we'll have them introduce themselves and say a little bit more about that. And then finally, well, we don't actually have anyone signed up for public comment. So I don't think we can take that off the agenda. Nobody signed up. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so starting with housing analysis findings, Jim is going to take us through the data, but before we get there, I'm going to start with some zooming in a little bit closer on the findings from the engagement portion. So after the last time we went over the findings from the survey, I went through all of the open-ended responses and tabulated those, and also pulled out some housing specific findings from our listening session notes. So that's what these slides are going to be about here. In response to the question, there was 2 questions at the beginning of the city plan survey. One was, what do you find most challenging about living in Charleston? And there were a lot of answers related to housing and the cost of living in Charleston. And this, the most common were mentioned in relation to housing and sort of disparities in Charleston, where segregation and racism, racial and income inequality and inequity, unaffordable high cost of living, gentrification, loss of diversity, lack of representation, rapid growth and development, and homelessness. And then throughout the 4 housing labs that we held in the fall, the themes below emerged regarding housing challenges. So I've already gone over this with you all. This is a repeat material from the last time, but I wanted to come back to this just to set the context again as we're looking in the data. So again, gentrification and displacement were mentioned. Other things outside of housing, the price of housing itself, beyond mortgage or rent, cost of maintenance, high eviction rates, so being able to stay in housing, barriers beyond that, so background checks and other things that limit people's entry into available housing. People stuck in substandard housing or housing that's not meeting their needs because they can't afford to move. Absentee landlords. This one was interesting. So neighborhoods becoming consumer destinations. So losing that sense of community and that investment in community and being more feeling like it's more of a commercial destination versus a neighborhood. So that's another type of another way that gentrification has made an impact in certain neighborhoods, especially downtown. We know about the rising land values, rising property taxes, and people worried about this getting worse with sea level rise. And then, in addition to utilities, mortgage, property taxes, the flood insurance costs increasing, and then the cost to repair after flood damage is getting worse. And so all of these contributing to what we already know about the high cost of housing in Charleston. The next slide. So I tabulated the responses to, this is just what I showed you last time was the overall response to this question. So are you concerned about being able to stay in your current housing? But this one is showing you it broken down by zip code. And you'll see that the orange is very concerned. People answered very concerned about housing. The blue is somewhat concerned, and the gray is not concerned at all. So you can see how the different areas of the city compare. And if you're curious about the higher percentages in south of Calhoun, the next slide will explain why we're seeing some of these higher percentages in places where that are associated with higher value homes and homeowners, people that would maybe less likely be worried about housing costs. So if you could go to the next slide, Jim. I tabulated the reasons why people are concerned. So that there was a follow-up question to that first question, which is why, explain the reasons for your concern, or if you're not concerned, explain why. And so what we saw is a very high percentage for both who said very concerned and somewhat concerned, cited flooding, sea level rise, hurricanes as their reason for concern. And so these are not separated out. Some people cited multiple reasons. And so they may have cited flooding and cost of living, for example. That's not being shown here. So these are just anybody who said flooding, sea level rise in their answer were added to this tally. Cost of living versus income was the second highest alone. And I've separated that out from high rent prices and high homeownership costs because it does get at that relationship of income versus housing costs. And also people cited cost of living outside of housing costs. So it's expensive to live in Charleston, housing costs included. And that is just not, incomes are just not keeping up with that price tag to live in Charleston. So then you'll see that people who are renting were more likely to say very concerned versus people who are homeowners we're more likely to say somewhat concerned versus very concerned. So there's a difference there that makes sense in terms of housing security. The neighborhood environment answer is what that means is different types of things in the environment that were making it hard, that were deteriorating the quality of life for people and making them concerned about being able to stay there. So things that were contributing to that were infrastructure, noise, litter and pollution, tourists, college students, short-term rentals, crime, parking, and social and cultural changes. So everything from gentrification to not having the adequate infrastructure in place to support people living there. I'm not going to read through all of these. You can see them and we'll be sharing these slides after, but this gives you a bigger picture of all the different things that contribute to people's ability and choice to stay or move somewhere else. And then I also pulled out some of the themes from people who said they were not at all concerned. So and the one that was most interesting that I saw appear in other places too in the survey results were a lot of people are okay where they are, but they can't afford to move. So as long as the housing that they're in is suitable for their needs, they're fine. But if those needs change, if they're retiring, if they want to downsize, if their family is growing, if they are currently renting and they want to buy, they can't because there's nothing that they can afford. So they found that housing, at some time in the past when it was affordable and it's no longer is. And so they're stuck where they are, or they're going to be forced to move outside of the city or far away from their jobs. So that was something that I saw a lot of. And yeah, I think that's it in terms of points that I want to make from this information. And next slide, Jim. I think that's it for me. Oh, and this is backed up. So all these concerns that were cited based on qualitative data, this is backed up in the hard data as well. So this is information that we've pulled out and put on the Charleston City Plan website on the Explore tab. Go to charlestoncityplan.com/explore. You'll see this and more data, but this is showing that discrepancy between the household income and the rent or home sales price. So that discrepancy between wages and cost of living in terms of housing costs. And then when you break that down further by race, that the income disparities, the racial income disparities in Charleston are stark. And so when if you look at that difference between cost of living and income and the income disparities, and we know that this is especially true and challenging for Black households in Charleston. Okay, and I'll pass it to Jim to take it from here.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
It's really timely because you see all the articles in the paper recently about rents in this area and things like that. It's just amazing. But and you probably have been through this on the past. In terms of gentrification, what percent of the, I guess it's the peninsula versus the entire city, is African American or non-white versus white? Do you know that? Do you know those numbers? I know it used to be years and years ago. It was about, I thought it was 50-50, but now I know it's a lot different, I think.
We have that broken down somewhere. I don't know the number off of the top of my head.
That's all right.
We do have it somewhere. Philip, do you know that off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think all the data we have right now is American Community Survey data, which is sampled every year. So it's not a huge sample that they use, but so it can vary from year to year, and the margin of error can be pretty big. But the latest I've seen is we're looking at probably a 75 to 25 kind of split on.
Is that in the entire city or just the peninsula?
This would be for the entire city. Yeah.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
Yeah,
Okay, I appreciate
It's,
that.
right, and we'll have some statistics in the plan, of course, that show some of the breakdowns and kind of breaks them down even further than what we're talking, and shows you trends and what's kind of happening demographically in the city.
Right. And then the other point I wanted to make is, obviously we know the cost. We talked about all the articles on rents being so high in this area, but even home buying in this area, and I'll use Miss Jacobs has made such a desirable place for Burnsdown. Sunday, did you ever imagine how expensive homes are in Burnsdown? I was looking, it's unbelievable. But I mean, for anybody to buy in Burnsdown, I mean, they're $400,000, $500,000 homes.
And they were built as, war housing for the middle income people, affordable housing when they were built, and rental affordable housing, which is
It's
interesting.
amazing. When I look at the home sales over there, they're like almost always 400 grand, it seems like. And it's all your fault, Donna, for making that place such a desirable place to live, I guess.
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry about that.
And Charlie, what's amazing is that there's not just a house comes on the market. There's 3 offers that come in on that same house at that ridiculous price they have it listed at.
Right.
Yeah, you're not seeing much difference in the pricing from South Windermere. I mean, if you mean from Burnsdown to South Windermere, and the homes are a lot bigger in South. It's just that's still desirable, I guess.
Actually, Burnsdown is in keeping with South Windermere, and it really is astounding just because of you've got the the unfinished or the finished smaller second floor, but it's just a great neighborhood. Burnsdown is wonderful, close-knit sidewalks, and it feels more neighborly than really South Windermere does.
And it's interesting because we are a perfect example of high density, built to the street, small yards, all the things that people claim they don't find attractive. Is exactly how our neighborhood is designed and built. So it's kind of definitely a conundrum.
Go ahead. You're also 5 minutes to the city, that's for sure. So that's a big thing.
I also want to ask Philip about the data that you asked him about, Charlie. Will we get those additional data from the census that's just been done with the breakdown?
We will, unfortunately, and in fact, I just saw a press release from the census that they are now saying that just the redistricting data that we normally get December 30th or December 31st, at the end of the year after a census, we're not getting until September of this year.
Wow.
They keep pushing it back. And so, it's, and that's the data that does break down by age and race. So that's our first opportunity at a new look at, demographics in the city. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like we'll get that until later this year, well past, when the plan will be adopted.
And when elections will go in, because a lot of people felt like they would be redistricted before the elections coming up.
Right.
Interesting. Thank you.
And Philip, I'd also be interested to know, I know you said it was about 75%, 25% white, black, I guess, in the entire city. I'd be curious, and I don't need this now, but maybe eventually in the peninsula, because I know peninsula used to be 50-50. Now I'm sure it's very small percent. I mean, the gentrification is unbelievable in the peninsula of Charleston, I would think.
I don't recall off the top of my head what the peninsula is, but I think you're right, Charlie. It's a much bigger.
It's 22%.
22%.
Yes, it's 22%,
Wow.
according to the Chamber of Commerce.
And I think I'm probably going back 20 years ago. It was probably 50-50 or 40-60, but that's crazy. So yeah. Thank you, Ms. Bryant. Okay, I'm sorry.
I think this is a timely.
We ready? We can move forward
I
whenever
think
you're
you're on
ready.
mute, Jim. You got me. Jim's getting his audio worked out. I can hear him, but only because he's on the other side of the cubicle wall for me. So,
While he's doing that, anybody have any other questions in terms of the what we covered so far? I just think the numbers are unbelievable.
Charlie, I do have a question. It's mainly about the first slide that Chloe showed.
Okay.
Chloe, can you go back to the first? I think it might have been the very first slide.
yes, hold on. Jim's doing screen share, but I'm going to take over from him since he's trying to get his sound working. Okay, so you said very, very first slide, this one?
Right, the engagement findings, right. In response to the question, what do you find most challenging about living in Charleston?
Yes.
So, all right, when you have these answers here, are they ranked based on, are they ranked in terms of this was the most common answer, or is that just kind of a generalization of all the answers that you had?
I took out the ones that were relevant to the housing conversation in particular. So there were a lot more themes than this one, or than this list here in response to this question. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I pulled out the ones that that were related to housing.
Okay, so with the answer of segregation and racism, and racial and income inequality, but specifically on the segregation and racism, is there some way that we can identify what particular pocket or part of the city, was being identified as being segregated or incurred racism, or was that just kind of a general statement at the time?
There were more general statements. I mean, because it's open-ended, I don't know that I could filter. The way that I process this would be very difficult for me to go back and sort of filter by people who cited these and see where they're coming from in terms of zip code, but zip code would be the closest that we could get to.
Okay.
But I think they were talking, certainly we could look at race across the city by neighborhood and see there are metrics the census has even for I think, or maybe that's inequality, but there are metrics that we could use to measure segregation in the city. And then I think the people who cited racism were just speaking generally about the city. But I included those because of housing discrimination and the links with that, and then the segregation and the effect on communities and where housing is located and how neighborhoods were developed. So it's related, but I would say that and it's good for us to keep in mind, but I wouldn't say that it was there wasn't a majority there. It was common enough to include. It was cited by multiple people, but it wasn't a dominating response.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Can people hear me now? Okay. All right. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm so sorry. While I was muted, I was going to say that this is a good segue. I think the question that we've been talking about as far as how race breaks down around the city is actually something that we will have the ability to do with our housing tool, our housing lookup tool, is to actually break down demographics by neighborhood boundaries, as well as by plan districts. So I think it's a good little segue into my portion of the slides, which is to talk about the final data deliverables that we've gotten from CDP. And so the biggest of those is our Charleston housing tool. And that is basically an interactive database that allows us to pull different information based on different location filters, different boundaries. And you can see all of the different housing data metrics that we have within that tool. And then all of the demographics information. And then here are the location filters that we can pull that by. So this is a awesome tool, and it's going to help us answer a lot of questions that we haven't even thought of yet. And so yeah, I just wanted to share what is now available for us to look at. Some of this stuff is information that CDP compiled through their machine learning process that I still don't quite understand, and some of it is from sources that we already had. So like the county assessors data, some of the stuff comes from that database, and then there's some other ones that we've put together internally. So I won't go through the whole list, but you can see it here. And then here's just a kind of a little sample overview of how I use the tool just to find this information for kind of the median housing unit, the bedroom size and square foot size. We have time since last sale, which is really interesting, especially when looking at neighborhood change. We've got elevation, monthly housing costs, and that is rental and home ownership. They just kind of lumped it into one housing cost, so it's for both. And we have the valuation, median valuation. We can pull all of these by different neighborhood boundaries as well. And here's a sample of some of the demographics information there at the bottom in blue. And so all of this is really amazing stuff that we haven't had at our disposal to this point, or at least is not as easily as we can search now. So we wanted to dive in the other two major deliverables that they provided, and those are the visualizations. You all have already seen the first of which, but we can kind of look at it again. Not much has changed. A few units were added, and we've kind of been doing some quality assurance. Yep.
Can you zoom in some to have this spread the screen a little bit more? It's a little hard to see. Back up a little bit. Back up more. There, right there.
Is that good? Cool. And if anyone needs me to stop on something or go back, just let me know. So you all have already seen a lot of these figures, and these are going to be publicly available for people to look up using our city plan website. We already have the other visualization up right now, but I think the plan is to have both of these available to the public. Wanted to point out that you can actually filter using this map over here on the left. So we can filter by different areas of the city, which I think is really great. None of this really has changed since you all saw it last. And yeah, obviously this is kind of one of the biggest takeaways from this data tool. So we can stop here for a second. We spent a lot of time talking about that mismatch on our last update to you all. So I wanted to kind of go over it again, kind of elaborate on it more with some additional slides that are coming in a few minutes. And so here, just to remind you, we have the number of households that are falling within each of these income brackets on the left side. And when you hover over, you can see the actual numbers. So yeah, I apologize, it's a little bit small print here. But basically this is showing you, by area of the city, which you can filter in over here. So we can look at a specific area of the city if we want to. This is just the entire city. So we have the number of households that are falling within these different income categories here on the left side. And then in the middle, we have the number of units, the housing stock itself. So the number of units that CDP's machine learning algorithm classified as being affordable to each of these income brackets. So that's in the middle. So I think the term available here is a bit of a misnomer. These are not necessarily available units. They're just units that are occupied or existing within the city. And so here on the right, we have what we're calling the mismatch. And so this is kind of showing that we don't necessarily have an efficient distribution of our housing stock. And so we have people that are living with in different income brackets that are living in homes that don't align perfectly with their income bracket. And so that, and we'll talk about it later, and that is going to be due to a lot of different factors. So we can talk about it in just a moment. But I just wanted to kind of give us a refresher, and you can hover over here and see all the different actual raw numbers. And then we can sort by different areas of the city. Here's Daniel Island, for example, how it breaks out on Daniel Island and the Cainhoy Peninsula as well. And here at the bottom, these figures are for, they're going to align with this district that, oh, sorry, no, they're actually broken already out by different plan districts here at the bottom. But these are going to match up with the mismatch figures above. And so what this is taking the mismatch in each specific income bucket, and then also accounting for the our expected population growth in the next 10 years, and which is something that Philip puts together for our kind of estimations for the next 10 years based on what's been permitted and approved through the development process to this point.
Yeah, Jim, I don't want to interrupt you. Sunday, I keep trying to figure out where all that affordable housing is on Daniel Island, you know? Anyway, sorry.
I can tell you exactly where it is.
Where is it?
Well, keep in mind, keep in mind, it's also including the Wando area. And so, you know, this is Daniel Island plus Wando, make up the full Cainhoy Peninsula area. And this is also reflective of the current income distribution of the city. And so the future housing needs are in keeping with, if we keep with the current income distribution of the city and accommodate future population, that's, you know, this is where the different units are needed. So, you know, that's not, that could explain some of this as well.
Yeah. And I apologize if I insult anybody with some of these comments I make. Anyway.
No, Charlie, you're fine. But just to clarify, I think on Daniel Island, we've done a really good job of integrating the affordable housing just within everything else. So it doesn't stand out for the most part. It's blended in different areas, but it is there. Okay,
no, I appreciate it because I remember, and the reason I picked on Sunday was she'll remember when I guess when we started Daniel Island way back when Frank Brumley and Matt came to us and talked about the affordable housing component. So I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. And also another point of clarification is we are using the income brackets here that HUD uses for subsidized housing to determine the different funding sources and the different needs in terms of subsidized housing. But also some of this housing could just be naturally affordable for these income ranges. It's not going to be a common situation in Charleston with prices as they are, with the market as it is. But this is not all deed restricted or subsidized housing. This is just housing that is priced, renting at a price that is affordable to people in these income ranges. So that's also something to keep in mind with this visual here.
And I also need to understand that there's a difference between affordable and obviously workforce housing. It's a big difference.
Well, in our ordinance, in our zoning ordinance, when we say workforce housing, it is referring to the 80 to 120% bracket. So if you look on this table, that is Jim's pointing those out right now, 80 to 120%. But when we use the term affordable housing, at least most of the time internally, we're talking about everything sort of 120% and below, falling within that, that which includes workforce housing.
Thank you. Sunday, you had a question?
Yeah, Chloe, is this information in our Dropbox? Will we be able to pull this up and look at it, where we can see it clearer?
Yes, we'll have the slide. I'll save the slides to the Dropbox after this meeting, and there will be links. So you'll be able to click on the links that Jim has clicked to, and these are public. So we don't have this one loaded onto our website yet, but we will soon. But these are public. This is publicly available information at this time, so we can share those links.
That's amazing information too.
Yes, thank you,
Amazing.
Chloe.
Thank you.
And one thing before we move on from this that I wanted to mention, we've said it before, but I want to really underscore the fact that these numbers down here are not necessarily reflective of, if you were looking at this graph, you might think we don't need any 100% AMI units within the city. And that's not the message that we want you to walk away when looking at this, because, these are kind of in a perfect world. If we could put everyone out on their street and put them in a home that is affordable to their income range, this is how it would break down. So obviously, people choose to live in homes for a lot of different reasons other than their affordability. And so, whereas, we know for a fact that there are people cost burdened at each of these income ranges. And so we know for a fact that we need units at each of these income ranges to accommodate. And so this is really just to balance this mismatch number. It's not necessarily reflective of us needing to build only at certain AMI ranges. And I think that's really important. But before I think we might be able to answer some other questions that might be brewing in your minds. Chloe made this really great graphic, which I think helps really understand it. Chloe, please jump in if I'm not describing it correctly. But I think last time when we met with you all, we were looking at we had the visual of the beaker that we showed you all, and the different housing cost brackets arranged in a beaker, and we made the point that whenever someone is looking for a home that's outside of their income bracket, they have to take housing stock from someone else in theory. And so what we wanted to really underscore this time is to say that phenomenon is occurring from both sides of the income spectrum. So we have people that are making more than, we have people that are occupying homes that are in the range for someone making less than they make, and we also have the inverse taking place as well. So for example, if we look at here, this is that mismatch graphic. It's the same exact thing that we showed you on the other screen, broken out a little bit easier to see. And so here you can see that we have a deficit of about 7,000 units for the 30% AMI bracket. And so the phenomenon here that we're talking about is, say, if you're a person making that 30% AMI and you cannot find a home or an apartment that fits your income level, then you might need to take up a home or apartment for someone that's making it for 50% AMI, and so on and so on. The same thing might be occurring if you're making over 120% AMI. We have a deficit of homes that are affordable to that income range as well. So that's the top half, or the top of our chart here. And so a person making 120% AMI could also be living in a home that's affordable for someone making 100% AMI. And so Chloe made this graphic that kind of shows if these the bottom and top income ranges ate up the housing of the next one below it, this will be the deficits that we would have. So if all of these 7,000, this deficit of 7,000 was eaten up by that 50% AMI, we'd still have a deficit of 5,000, and so on and so on. And so on the other side of it, if all of the deficit, this 17,000, was eating up our 100%, 20% stock, we'd still have a deficit of 7,000. So eventually these two will meet, and this is why we're seeing people cost burden at all income levels. It really comes from both sides of the spectrum. And I hope that I didn't make it more confusing. And Chloe, please chime in if anything I said was confusing.
No. Just wanted to illustrate the fluid nature of this. And when we have a shortage in housing stock for one income range, that it affects the supply and housing for other income ranges. So and as you can see here below this, of the other factors contributing to housing choices, when you combine this income mismatch with all of these other things, it leads to the situation that we're in now, which is with a high percentage of the population being cost burdened in Charleston. And so, which is our next visualization.
Chloe and Jim, I have a quick question here, and I hope I can articulate it to where it makes sense. But how do we quantify in this data people that, let's say, live in Hanahan or Goose Creek or Ladson or outside of the city of Charleston in a non-cost burdened way, only because, but they work in Charleston, would rather live closer? How do we integrate that information, or is it integrated into this analysis in some format? Did that make sense? I
think it definitely makes sense. And I think it was outside of the scope of what we did. We looked at homes that are within the urban growth boundary, okay. And so I think that is definitely a great question to have, and it is something that we need to understand better. But I think for the purposes of CDP's analysis, we stayed within the urban growth boundary, and that's how they did their valuations. But it's definitely very interesting, and something that is contributing to all of this is when people, when all of this stock is eaten up, people are forced to go elsewhere. And I think this next graphic that we're going to show that's related to housing and transportation kind of speaks to that as well, though it still is staying within the urban growth boundary for our area of analysis.
Well, that's where I was going, was that you create the secondary problem of transportation when people are forced outside of the city for their housing stock. So I was just curious how that was factored in, because it probably, even though we don't get the data, we're aware of it, and it creates an opportunity for a planning, implementation, objective. Okay, thank you.
I think Donna's point is spot on, though. I run a business on Kiowa Island of 105 employees. And 9 years ago, 65% of our employees lived on Johns Island. And we're probably pushing 60% Somerville and Goose Creek today. So this data doesn't even capture those folks. So it's probably worse than what you're able to represent.
Definitely. We went back and forth when we were working with CDP and kind of the beginning stages of what area do we want to look at for this analysis. And I think because it's the City of Charleston's comprehensive plan, and the data sources that we had available internally that we're dealing with the city within the city's boundaries, I think is why we made that choice. But absolutely something to really think about. But yeah, so I'll just let me go back. I think next we want to show the other visualization that we have. Where did I hide it? Aha. So yeah, so here's the other big public-facing deliverable that CDP provided. And I'll zoom in on this too. Maybe I zoomed in a little bit too far. So with this one, this background slide just has some information on, what we were looking at. And the data sources that we use. So for this, these pie charts are showing the percent of households within a certain area of the city. In this case, we're looking at the city as a whole. The percent of households paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And then this is if we throw transportation costs into that housing cost. And so this is still within the 30% threshold. And we use that 30% because HUD deems that as acceptable to pay for housing. When you go above that 30%, you're cost burdened. And so each of, we can look at different areas of the city, which I think is great. This is already up on our city plan website.
Can you show the Johns Island one, Jim? I think that one's the most.
Oh, yeah.
Like surprising, or not, maybe not surprising, but like, whoa.
Yeah. So here we're looking at Johns Island, and I'll give you some background on the transportation data that we use. We used a source called the Housing and Transportation Index, and what that group has done is created an algorithm that looks at urban form and street design to estimate the vehicle miles traveled for different census blocks. And so you can search the city of Charleston or even a single census block to see the average vehicle miles traveled. And so they do that calculation. And then they also use the ACS data for the amount of cars owned per household. And so what we did was multiply that fixed cost of car ownership, so how many cars you own per household, and then multiply by the variable vehicle miles traveled. And then we also added in DMV, registration, taxes, costs. And so that's how we came up with this transportation cost. But you can see when we go over to this tab, we have a bar graph. Let me go out a little bit that shows the different areas of the city broken out by their costs. And I think that this is, for me, this is a very interesting data point that we found in looking at, as we would expect, some of the places that are further out, the Kahnaway Peninsula and Johns Island, are going to have higher transportation costs. People are more car dependent and own more cars per family. They're also traveling more vehicle miles. And so one of the big, illuminating things for me was that sometimes those transportation costs are kind of eating into the savings that you get for living in a less expensive home. And so on Johns Island, we see a lot, a lower valuation for the homes. But then, that savings of the housing cost is kind of eaten up by transportation. It becomes almost the same as living on the Charleston Peninsula when you account for transportation, which I think is really interesting. And with this pie chart, we included that transportation cost into the 30% as like the cost burden threshold. But HUD doesn't actually provide a figure for how much homes or households should pay for transportation. So I wanted to note that because, that 30% might not be fair to say that, if we put transportation into that someone is cost burdened. But it's just a way that we can compare across different areas of the city. So yeah, this is available up online. We'll share the link to that, and you can look around. Down here, we just have some information about how we calculated everything. Right. And I'm almost finished with my portion. Yeah. So let me present. So I think all of this is kind of building to, especially looking at that mismatch data and looking at kind of all the factors that play into housing choice. And then we also wanted to look at some of the outside factors that are contributing to the state of our housing stock. One of them was market supply and demand. And I think throughout this process, we spoke with developers, we spoke with the Association of Realtors and some other folks that talked about housing stock, the housing shortage, and any housing is good housing to be built right now. And so this was a graph or an article that we found online that was an interesting point that Charleston really is building a lot of new homes. Comparing to some of these other cities that have a high demand at the moment, we're actually building. We have a higher growth rate than a lot of these other cities. So we just thought that was really interesting. And then the next,
Jim, Harry has a question.
Oh,
Jim, is this number certificates of occupancy issued, or is this units approved to be built?
I believe it's approved units.
All right.
Yeah. And so, yep. And so, and here's another data point that is up on our Explore tab, and just covering, the amount of homes that have been built within the last, I believe this is, 2010 to 2019. And so, we have a lot of units going up around the city. Down here, we wanted to share the vacancy rate, which I think is an interesting data point, is that there's always a certain amount of units that are vacant at any time. Ours is about 9.6%, and the US average is around 8.6% of units that are unoccupied for whatever reason. So that could be second homes, it could be vacation rentals, or units that are unoccupiable for whatever reason. And I thought this number was interesting when you compare it to Charleston County as a whole. Granted, this is CDP's calculation here for vacancy, and this is the ACS, so we're not comparing the exact same data sources, but I think it's interesting that Charleston County is showing an 18% vacancy rate compared to the city of Charleston's 9.6. And then we wanted to compare like another tourist kind of tourism dependent place within kind of near us. And so we looked at Horry County that has a 38% vacancy rate, which is kind of to be expected with all the vacation properties around there. But and then the last thing that we wanted to talk about, I think last time we met with you all, we expected to have a third visualization, and we have not forgotten about that third visualization. We have all of the data, a lot of the data packaged for it, but we're still kind of playing with that internally, and it's something we've decided we wanted to build out on our own. And so that's going to be a gentrification and displacement analysis. And so what we'll look at in that visualization is how neighborhoods have changed based on some of these different data metrics that research has showed to be contributing to gentrification, or kind of beacons for gentrification. So each of these points. And so we're tracking those. We have a lot of this data packaged already that, it's kind of how we can measure gentrification and how a neighborhood has changed. And then we also wanted to look at priority areas. So one of the big takeaways from our housing labs was people are interested in gentrification, but they're more interested in identifying places before they've gentrified. And so being proactive about displacement is something that we wanted to do. And so the other part of that visualization, we'd like to use kind of these three different metrics, percent cost burden, percent renter occupied, and then a climate related risk from our water analysis to try to identify different neighborhoods that may be at risk of displacement in the future. And so in the short term, we're going to put a lot of these things, like I said, we have a lot of this data already. So you should see some static maps and tables in the comp plan itself. But in the long term, we'd like to build another public-facing interactive tool that we can share with people. So that's something that we are going to be doing in the next few months.
Jim, that'd be really interesting, because I tell you, I think about like West Oak Forest and East Oak Forest, and I remember those were pretty diverse And now I think they're almost all young whites moving into those areas, I think, and it concerns me that area, but also then I think about Maryville, and more of Maryville probably becoming gentrification in the Maryville area as well. So anyway, that'd be interesting to see all that.
Yeah, Charlie, I'd like to back you up on that, because a lot of neighborhoods West Ashley were built, you know, for low income. They transitioned to another type. Now they're transitioning back to even a third type. So there's a cycle in there that even in modern time, people don't completely understand. They think that certain neighborhoods were built for African Americans, and that's been a transition that happened in history. And then we went from white to an African American to a mixed use, and now we're, you know, moving. So I think understanding that transition that happened over time is important too.
And we hear from those people from Maryville a lot, and I see a lot of the pressures in that area as well, West Ashley. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I think this this breakdown is also interesting for kind of thinking about how we can tailor different policy approaches to achieve the outcomes that we want. Because, you know, a lot of neighborhoods are changing in different ways, so the same solutions won't fit each neighborhood. And we can look at kind of the different factors that go into that, and maybe tailor some policy solutions to those specific issues.
Thank you, Jim. Donna, you had a question?
Yeah.
Donna?
Y'all are getting a huge amount of data here. Are y'all beginning to see some, you know, planning opportunities or questions or thoughts coming from this data at all? Are you, that y'all are going to, you know, as you write the plan based on the data, I'm just wondering, are the questions coming to your mind? Because one question that immediately popped into my mind is that this concept of the missing middle, that we don't have all the right types of housing stocks, or we don't have a zoning code that gives us opportunities to quickly create housing of the types that we need. I was just wondering if these types of questions are popping into y'all's mind as you're looking at the data.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I just wonder, well, I mean, those, I just was hoping, because we're just hearing the data from y'all, but you're not kind of leading us into maybe what the opportunities are for planning based on the data. And I think that's, you know, what everybody's anxious to hear. So thank you.
Yeah, I think up to this point, we've really been trying to make sure that the product that we received from CDP is something that's going to be really useful for us and for other departments in the city. And so that has been a task in itself. And I think all the questions that come with all this data is the other elephant that we've got to swallow. So it's really, I see that Ms. Harrison has her hand raised.
Go ahead, ma'am.
So I've got kind of two observations. The first, going just to the data that y'all presented about the various areas. So I think I don't know how we educate the public about, you know, about the number of housing units that are coming online or are permitted, because I know we, you know, consistently see certain areas, such, you know, what specifically James Island, they have only 2,000, I think, total units. But seemingly, you know, I was underneath the impression that they had significantly more coming online, but yet West Ashley, the peninsula, and other areas are carrying a greater weight of those number of units. So I think I think that particular data point is something I think we can utilize to kind of talk about housing and plans and developments. The second thing I wanted to kind of, you know, talk about is how we utilize the word gentrification, just because there are various ways that people define it. And, you know, what does that really mean? Some people, you know, what does that really look like? I've never really heard a solution for how you stop gentrification, or what, you know, how you implement ways to reverse gentrification or to stop it. But then, you know, in the same vein, you know, there's always the person who is, you have to have a willing seller and a willing buyer. And so that to me also is something that, you know, doesn't necessarily speak of gentrification. It just speaks of, you know, holding on to a piece of property for generations and then saying it's time to let go for myriads of reasons. So how are we presenting that definition or saying what is gentrification, you know, to the public?
That's a great question. I'll take this one, Jim. So the way that we have this drafted right now in the third visualization that still needs more tweaking, which is the reason why we don't have that ready for you all, is just showing how the neighborhood is changing. Like you said, it's people have different definitions of gentrification. People have different experiences with it. And there's so many different factors contributing to it. So our plan is not to, is to bring out this data and make it available for people to see and to understand how our neighborhood's changing around the city. Pulling out these indicators that have been attributed or have been associated with gentrification, you know, and by the definition of a lower income neighborhood, I'd say nationally, lower income becoming higher income, generally speaking. And then Charleston gentrification having that racial component as well, you know, being very significant and relevant here for our local context. So racial and income change from a neighborhood lower income, higher Black population to higher income and higher white population. And these other indicators too are helpful in understanding how our neighborhood's changing. So we're not planning to assign value to whether, you know, what it means and if it's good or bad, but just being able to draw out how our neighborhood's changing. What we are going to focus on in terms of planning recommendations and, you know, what tools do we have as planners is we're going to focus on the displacement part of this, which is does not always go along with gentrification or neighborhood changing. And displacement, the definition being, you know, sort of some level of involuntarily having to move, having to leave. So that's why we focused on looking at percent of the population that's cost burdened in a neighborhood, percent of homes that are renter occupied. So, you know, they have less control if their rent goes up versus a homeowner can have pretty reliably know how much their annual housing costs are going to be. And then the climate factor as well. So we're going to focus on this part. We're going to show how neighborhoods are changing. And we want to provide that data because we think it's important for the community to have and for, you know, staff and elected officials and commissioners to have access to and to have conversations about. But I think where we're really going to focus on in the plan in terms of any kind of policy recommendations or land use recommendations will be on the risk of displacement and what kind of interventions, whether it be on the planning side or the housing side, how can we prevent displacement as being that the main negative outcome, the more tangible outcome of gentrification that we want to prevent and mitigate whenever possible.
And thank you, Chloe. I did have one other question, and I know that y'all's data has broken it down to the various, I guess we call it the boroughs of Charleston, but in particular, is it possible to break that data on the peninsula down a bit further where we're looking at, you know, north of Calhoun Street in terms of that breakdown of like the displacement, the cost of housing, rentals versus non-rentals, accommodations uses, because, you know, the peninsula has its, you know, various parts to it that are either commercial housing related, but, you know, we don't know, you know, which neighborhoods are, you know, even at further risk.
Yes, so we have all of this data at a neighborhood level. So we're pulling out, well, the cost burdened for the two visuals that Jim showed, the affordability analysis and then the housing and transportation cost burden, two visuals that are interactive. Those are just by main area of the city. But the information that Jim has displayed right now on the screen, we have we have this information on every single housing unit in the city. And so for the gentrification and displacement analysis, our plan was to look at those indicators on a neighborhood scale, on a neighborhood level versus just the larger area of the city. So yeah, there's a lot that we can answer with this data. I will say that we probably can't answer all questions for the comprehensive plan, but we hope that some of these bigger picture recommendations will lead to more in-depth, smaller scale analysis going forward. So to continue this investigation and this analysis on a deeper level beyond the comprehensive plan, because we'll have the data available.
Thank you, Chloe. Any other questions? Go ahead, Donna, you go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo Ms. Harrison's comment on the definition of gentrification, because I think what it might have meant 20 years ago, it's probably changed in modern time. There are lots of communities where people actually own their property, and I've had conversations with these people where once they choose to sell their property, the dynamic will change because of the buyer. And I think we need to understand that. So I'm glad she brought this issue up and that there's a good conversation about it and that we'll continue to understand it, and the city's beginning to see it in a really big picture. So I just wanted to echo her comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Any other questions of Jim?
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, Mr. Chairman, I agree with both Donna and Erica. You know, I'd always kind of seen gentrification as not necessarily racial, which so many people feel like, but it's really about the loss of diversity in a neighborhood, whether it's age or income or race or any of those other categories that we were looking at on those data points that we're gathering here. So I think it's important that we look at it in the broadest possible way, that we want diverse neighborhoods, no matter what type of thing you're measuring. So. Good
point, Harry. And you know, one of the things I think when I talked about the differences and the changes it was just so devastating for me, or unbelievable, the African American. So I just point that's just me on that. But I agree with you. Gentrification is a lot bigger word than just race. So I appreciate that. That's good comments. Anybody else comments, questions? No, Jim, thank you for your work and your presentation. Chloe?
Thanks, Charlie. Before I move on to this, I just will put it out there. Yeah, this is one of the things that we'll have to define in the plan itself. You know, if we are referencing gentrification displacement, we'll need to include definitions. I think that will be important in the narrative. So if anybody in their work, has found a really good definition that they like and wants to send it our way, we're happy to, take suggestions. Of course, we'll be doing we've done our own research and we'll be incorporating that into the plan and we'll be putting that to the community and to you all for feedback. But if anybody has spent some time with this and has some good definitions that they want to send along.
Thank you, Chloe.
Be happy to see them. Okay, so I know we're over the expected time for this, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. So to recap, round one, some of the high level numbers from that, we had approximately 480 people participate in either a city-led or a community-led gathering. This is not including survey respondents, it's just people who showed up to some sort of gathering, virtual or in person. 39% of people who participated in a listening session said in the beginning poll that they had never or have rarely participated in any kind of planning process. So that's a great number of new people to this conversation. And something else we learned from round one is the community-led conversations, and that partnership with community partners was essential in increasing the diversity of our participants. So city-led meetings were a little less diverse, but those community-led meetings really made a huge difference in increasing the diversity of our overall participation. So for round 2, our priorities are going to build on progress in round 1, continue targeting, prioritizing getting more participation from underrepresented groups. So we still have definitely a lot of progress we can be making in that regard. And continue to prioritize the quality of engagement over quantity. So just making sure that those are, positive experiences, and so that people come back and continue to stay engaged. And also providing a variety of options for engagement. So we offered a variety, we were going to expand that variety even more in round 2. The next slide. We do not have specific dates and times yet for the meetings, but we will by next week. And we're going to publish those in our first newsletter of the year, which will go out next week. And also registration will be open at that time. So stay tuned. The first couple of weeks of March, our engagement team is going to be, and city staff are going to be working on getting the word out about upcoming engagement, re-engaging people into what the city plan is and to get involved, trying to recruit new people into the process that weren't part of round 1. And then we will have 10 virtual meetings. So starting mid-March, going through mid-April, we'll have 10 virtual meetings and 5 in-person drop-in stations. So of the 10 virtual meetings, 2 of those will be for primers or orientations for people who are coming in fresh, that were not part of round 1 and may need some introduction to what the city plan is. So we'll have 2 of those in mid-March, and then we will have 5 sessions, 1 for each of the geographic areas of the city, to go over the recommendations specific to those areas. And then we will have 2 topic-based sessions. So looking more closely at recommendations specific to certain elements of the plan, like housing or natural resources or transportation. And then we will again do 1 Spanish language session. Then for the 5 in-person stations, those will be no contact drop-in stations where we'll have a set time where they're set up in a certain area of the city, and there'll be 1 strategically located in each area of the city. And we're going to be choosing those locations based on prioritizing areas where there's likely to be more people who don't have access to the virtual meeting, such as our elderly population. So in late April is when we're going to be wrapping up engagement mid to late April and move into synthesizing that feedback, incorporating to the plan. And that is when we anticipate to schedule the first public hearing before you all. That's that date. We're waiting to schedule that date because this is really a moving target still with COVID. And also when we can actually wrap up having the draft plan itself in document form. And May is when we anticipate continuing that public hearings and bringing it to City Council and Planning Commission for a joint workshop. So that is the plan. And again, dates and times to be confirmed. And this is subject to change. This has been a fluid process. It will continue to be with all of the uncertainty in this world right now. You can go next, please. Next slide. Oh, actually, can you go back, Jim? Go back to the engagement. Any questions about engagement before I go into the next surprise update? Not seeing any hands. Okay, last update. This is something that's a recent development this year. We're really excited about. So we're like I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we're partnering with the College of Charleston, the Community Assistance Program. We have 2 awesome graduate assistants working with us on incorporating a racial equity lens into Charleston City Plan. And so I'm actually going to call on Ryan and Caitlin now to introduce themselves. And if y'all want to say a little bit what you're doing with us, and then I can wrap us up.
Hello, everyone. I am Ryan Green. I'm a Charleston native. I'm a graduate assistant at the College of Charleston.
Can you speak up?
Okay,
Mr.
sorry.
Green, can you speak up just a little bit?
Got you. Like, my mic has always been low. My name is Ryan Green. I'm a second-year CAP student, and I'm a Charleston native. I'll let Caitlin go next.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name's Caitlin. I am a first-year graduate student at College of Charleston, and I'm actually in the concurrent program with the MPA and EVSS, and this is my first year of CAP being a grad assistant. And I'm originally from Rhode Island, so I'm new to the Charleston area, but we're both really excited to be on this project.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. And a bit of an overview of what we're doing. We are basically looking at other cities' comprehensive plans and researching data through the MPA program at CFC to have a racial equity lens over the plan, because as been stated before, like there's a steady declining Black population, and historically it has not been that way. So some things are going on in the background that most of us feel need to be addressed, and this is the first steps to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Good thoughts.
And I'll add, CAP is also working with our Commission on Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation on developing their framework for racial equity. And so we will be naturally coordinating with those efforts as well. We're actually, a little bit ahead of them in some ways in terms of actually defining and deciding what does racial equity mean in terms of Charleston City Plan and the recommendations that we're putting forward, and also what we're, the questions that we're asking and the recommendations that we're proposing. So they'll be doing some interviews with staff. We've already looked over some best practices from other cities with them. That conversation is ongoing. And they're also going to be participating in the engagement sessions, helping to take notes and help synthesize that feedback. So really excited about this partnership and the good intention. We wanted to be explicit about this and not just do it, but also make sure that we're articulating it and that we're having someone else take a look at what we're doing and help us see where we can fill some gaps.
Thank you, Chloe. Anything else?
That is it for our updates.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I think I recognize Mr. Green from a community engagement. Were you at some community engagements and listening in? Good. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to compliment the College of Charleston MPA program. They do such a great job. They've got great faculty and great students, and it's a real asset to the community. So I'm really glad we've got those CAP students involved here.
Agree, Mr. Hussain. Anybody else, comments, questions?
I see Christopher joined us. Christopher, is there any final parting thoughts?
Christopher, it's good to have you with us here.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I missed the first part of the meeting. I had a last minute council committee meeting that the mayor needed me on, but I hope to watch the first hour on YouTube. It'll be some of my viewing tonight because I hear that you all had lots of good comments and I'm excited to see those.
We're ready for you to have all the answers too. Any other comments or questions?
No pressure, Christopher.
If not, we'll stand adjourned, and thanks everyone for their time. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.